So over the course of this Wild series, we've been looking at ways to move on from collapse. So I've looked at a range of different ideas that we will need to or we will want to take into the what comes next. And we've also been looking at how we actually do what will have to be an emergent transition from an old world or old civilizational structure that's collapsing under the weight of its own messy, knotted complexity and into this new world. We've discussed what to do with the grief that's bound to descend in coming years, how we raise kids going forward, and how we can use the denial that will no doubt kick in, how we can do the emergence that keeps coming up as the modality for change and the vehicle for all of this. Now, today, in this 11th conversation in the 12-part series, I want to talk about how to bring people, so our friends, our neighbours, our family, along on the ride, how to get them to actually change their mindset, to let go of a system that really no longer serves them and to adopt a new, more life-generating ideology or set of ideas, but also how we can cooperate and collaborate better together so that we can, frankly, save our species and the world. So my guest today is Sarah Stein Lubrano. Sarah is a neuroscientist and a political scientist. She's the head of research for the Future Narratives Lab, which focuses on narratives about social and political change, and serves on the Institute of Imagination's Global Imagination Board. She's also recently published a book on this very challenging subject called Don't Talk About Politics: How to Change 21st Century Minds, which is perfectly apt. Now, this episode is one I've really wanted to have to bring together all the different themes that we've discussed in this series. Sarah dispels many of the old ideas about how we go about moving in better directions as a species and uses science and new psychological approaches to show how we'll need to go about things moving forward. We cover why political debates do not change people's minds and why the marketplace of ideas does not work. Then we talk about what does actually work and what we therefore need to be focused on as change makers and how to go about it most effectively, the communication hacks, the mindset tactics, and so on. We talk about social atrophy and how our brains actually change when we are isolated from other human beings. We talk about the critical role of third spaces and various gateways, rituals and practices that get people to the thing without using debate and the other techniques that don't work any longer. We talk through the cognitive dissonances and how to get around them, and we talk through the science that shows activists are happier than their non-activist peers. This chat is dripping in all kinds of very surprising factlets and science about how change can best happen when we're dealing with messy, complex, needy, tender humans. So, I hope you enjoy this conversation. Before we get started, Sarah will join over on Substack, so that's sarahwilson.substack.com, if you're keen to ask her or myself a question following the interview. And if you like, you can also watch this over on the YouTube channel. I'll put the links to that in the show notes, where I put all other links that I mention in this conversation. So do share this conversation far and wide for me. It is much appreciated. So let's now meet Sarah Stein Lubrano. Sarah, it's really lovely to see your face there after a few false starts due to a heat wave that we're both sitting in. It's kind of ironic, I think, just last week there was a big climate conference to talk about extreme heat and it had to be cancelled because of extreme heat.
I was at the climate thing yesterday in extreme heat. It was wild.
Yeah, the irony is no longer funny. You've got a new book that's come out, Don't Talk About Politics, and your thesis is that talking about politics doesn't bring people along. It won't move them into better, more life-generating kind of spaces. And it won't bring about the kind of cooperation we so desperately need at the moment. And we can look to the US, UK, and even Australia at the moment to see how that is in fact playing out. So why is it the case that talking through ideas and facts and so on and reasoning just doesn't work?
Yeah, so in my book, I look at a couple of things that we have long assumed, I think, at a cultural level are the right way for democracy to work, debate and a marketplace of ideas, And indeed, there is very little empirical evidence in the case of the marketplace of ideas, and basically zero evidence in the case of debate that people change their minds when they're exposed to these mechanisms. Like, there's a lot of evidence that when people watch debates online or on the TV, they don't change their minds at all. And that little like movement that you see the day after debate is just the statistical noise that you would see any given day. It's no different. And there are a lot of different reasons for this, and I kind of go into them in my book. I look at like this cognitive dissonance theory, which is actually what I wrote my PhD about. I look at some other reasons, but I think increasingly what I find most helpful to say is it's true for two reasons. So firstly, looking at cognitive dissonance theory as an example of a larger point about human psychology, we often can't change our mind when we're exposed to new ideas or information because they threaten really our sense of self, and particularly our sense of ourselves as good moral agents in the world. It's really difficult to change your mind if the thing you're going to have to do along the way is decide that you were wrong and then do like a massive surgery on the self. That's just painful. And there's particularly a lot of evidence in some of the studies I look at that it's political ideas in particular that challenge this. If I tell you that you happen to be wrong about how trees grow or something, you might not have any sort of ethical, moral attachments to that. It might not say anything about your sense of agency or self, and so you'll change your mind. And people do change their mind when they're exposed to new information all the time when it doesn't challenge this part of ourselves. But once it's a political thing, suddenly we realize, oh, damn, like maybe I'm the wrong person, the bad person, the person that could have caused a problem, etc. That's really hard. That's one way of answering a question. And I think that's a more common way of answering the question because many people write about these aspects of human psychology. People have written about persuasion before, But the other reason that people don't do this sort of changing their minds, and I think it's important to think about it this way as well, is just that there are other things that are even more powerful than arguments and debates in terms of our political views. And those things probably are so powerful that a lot of the debating and argumenting that happens on the internet and otherwise is like building a sandcastle on a beach. But like the thing that really matters is the tide, right? The sandcastle will be there very briefly. And the tide in this case seems to be, according to empirical research, our relationships with other people. That changes our mind about politics over the course of our life. And our own actions and experiences. Those things seem to change people in very profound ways, including their political beliefs. And they're so powerful that I think most other things are kind of ineffective,
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's dig down into those a little bit because you mentioned the two of them. Let's go relationships. To what extent do relationships change people's minds? I remember in Australia, there was a study done and it found that the most effective agents for the most recalcitrant climate deniers in Australia, being middle-aged, men, was their teenage daughters. That was actually the way to get through to them in terms of new information.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I hadn't actually heard about that particular one, but that completely makes sense to me, and fits in with a lot of other research. One example. This is a minor one, but it fits with what you just said. Is like there's good evidence that if you have an older sister, you become a bit more left wing, and if you have an older brother, you become a bit more right wing. And that's very simply because older brothers are more right-wing on average, and older sisters are more left-wing, and then they move their siblings, right?
God, that makes so much sense, Sarah, because, I'm the eldest of 6 children, and I just think about all the activists, because a lot of my friends are activists, and I don't know how often it comes up that we are the eldest daughters.
So yeah, it's partially this sort of relationality, and it's not, by the way, that we're like brainwashing people. We don't see, it's not like a massive effect where the relationship just brainwashes the other person. One of the things I particularly liked as a study is they looked at college roommates who are assigned randomly and how they affect each other's political views. Because that's kind of an interesting case study. People are like basically living together for a year. They didn't know each other otherwise, but they are talking all the time. And what they found, and I think this is a good model for what we're talking about, is yes, they move towards each other politically a little bit, not hugely, right? It's not the most important relationship in their life at the end of the day, and it's only 1 year. And also, we're not brainwashable mostly without cults or something, right? But what does happen is that if one of the housemates is, one of the roommates is very politically interested and the other one isn't, by the end of the year, they're both very interested in politics.
Okay.
And I guess what I would say is, I think this is a bit about what humans do for each other. It's not that we brainwash each other. It's not that we're always persuaded by each other. But we become attuned to things mattering that wouldn't otherwise matter to us because of our relationships. Like, I don't know about you, but there are all these things that now matter to me because of my romantic relationship, that just because the other person cares about them. They would never matter to me otherwise, but now I have thought about how to take them seriously. And politics is a question of mattering, really. And so what I think relationships really do for people is they they make the window of mattering much bigger. That's why climate change is a good example. I doubt that many of these men are incredibly intense climate deniers, although that could still have an effect anyway. But very often they just think this doesn't really matter that much. But then it matters to their kid, and slowly it comes to matter, and then their politics shift as a result. And our relationships are like our windows into the world, you know, or like the network of connection that we're strung across. And as it moves, we move too, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To what extent does really healthy role modeling work in that sort of instance? Because I often say to people, you know, who are concerned in this space, either previously as climate activists who are wanting to bring people along, now as, I guess, collapse aware types who are wanting to bring their friends, family, loved ones into the space so they can have the same level of recognition and awareness so they can make different choices about their future and so on. And what I say to people is we need to role model the fuck out of this. We need to actually illustrate how you can actually live vibrantly and positively in this space. If we walk around, you know, self-flagellating because we're so miserable with this level of awareness, you know, we're not going to bring anyone along for the ride. So to what extent does the quality of those relationships and the sort of the frisson of those relationships matter?
I sadly don't have any studies on frisson, which is a great word, but, you know, I think that the intensity of them matters for sure. You know, although there's some interesting studies about how our weak ties are also very important for different reasons because they expose us to things that we don't already have access to, right? Weak ties are always fascinating in this way for sociologists. As you might be able to tell, I'm a big sociology nerd. But, you know, the relationships matter. The intensity of them matters to a significant degree. But interestingly, I would say other things matter too. One of the things I look at in the book is that there are these kind of specific kinds of relationships that happen often in third spaces or workplaces that seem to make people less racist and otherwise less prejudiced. And what I look at is a field of study called social contact theory, which I think is pretty telling. And it basically suggests, and maybe this addresses your question about modeling, but in a different way. But what this field of study suggests is that when people are exposed to each other in conditions of equality with certain other qualifying factors, they become less prejudiced. And those conditions are really important. And if you don't have them, they probably won't become less prejudiced. And here are some of the conditions. The people have to be positioned as equals, both in practice and in theory. So it's not enough for the workplace to say you're equals. It needs to also be that actually there are some people of color on the board, you know? There needs to be regular conversations about the reality of your lives at length with someone else. So that could still be like in a workplace context, but you need to be having the kind of job, for example, where you can talk to your colleagues for a long period of time and essentially become friends. And I mean friends in the lighter sense of the word potentially, but, you know, they have to be talking. And then, interestingly, they have to have shared goals, right? They have to have shared goals.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think is very telling about that is that I think on the internet, we basically never have shared goals. Or, I mean, not never, but very rarely. It's very rare that you enter, unless you're on a very specific internet forum or something, we don't
get to establish them. We don't get to establish. We may have shared goals, but
the goals are the goals of the tech CEOs, right? Like the goal of the tech CEO is like, please scroll the internet aimlessly while feeling depressed about yourself and then buy some stuff. And that's not a shared goal that you could have with another human that would lead you to reduce your prejudice. So I guess what I'm saying is I think, you know, the intensity of the relationship matters. Modeling matters probably, certainly. But what seems to be most measurable as yet in this research, and again, you know, if I could design sociological research, we would be in a different world because we don't always measure the things I want to measure, you know. But the research that we do have suggests that a lot of it is about really having time to experience the other person as an equal and understand what their life is like and share lived experiences with each other. And I want to say also that I'm not saying this in a perfectly like Pollyanna-ish way, because I think there's a certain kind of basic messaging that is brought across about this that is like, yay, this is so good. We can like reduce racism by making Black people hang out with white people who suck. And, you know, like, that sucks for Black people and also, in a way, for everyone. I think it's important to see that research and care about it and also be like, well, that's going to suck for a lot of people. But this is the way people change their minds. And maybe it's not always their, you know, I'm not implying here necessarily that it's their duty. Like, I think it's a very complicated moral fact that this seems to be what shifts people.
So Sarah, two things really come to mind here. There's a study that you're probably aware of that looked into that shared goals idea on people who work on Wikipedia updates.
Oh,
And
no,
yeah, it's super interesting, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. So what they found was that the more diverse the political opinions of people who worked on a Wikipedia entry, the better the outcome. And it goes against what we often feel is the case, because we think that people can't get on if they've got different political opinions. But what actually happens is that if they have a shared goal, i.e. producing a great Wikipedia outcome, the dissonance, the difference in opinion in terms of where they come from actually assists what they're doing. And I think that's a really incredible sort of study, because what it says is the shared goal trumps the differences in opinion in terms of politics. So I sort of was thinking of that one. The other one, I don't know if you heard about a study that just came out a couple of weeks ago here in France. They found that every time a tobacco is like a little corner coffee shop / bar where people buy their cigarettes, they buy the newspaper in the morning and have a coffee standing at the bar with their neighbours and so on. And it's also where they will come and have a sandwich at lunch, you know, and then it's also where they come in the evening and have an apéro and sit around chatting, you know, before they head off to dinner. And so every village in France tends to have one. It'll have nothing else, but it'll have a tobacco, you know.
Yeah.
And in Paris, where I live now, there's one on, you know, every second corner. And what they've found is that every time a tobacco shuts down, and there's been 18,000 of them that have shut down in the last, I think, 10 to 20 years, the far right vote spikes. And the connection, and apparently it's so direct. If you shut down a bakery or a hairdresser, the same thing doesn't happen. It's specifically these third spaces where the community comes together, and all of those touch points you mentioned, you know, come to bear here. It's an equalizer. People come to a tobacco and they come from all different walks of life. So it's an equalizer. They spend quite a decent amount of time together talking about the issues of the day. It's not just a passing, you know, thing at the water cooler. It's an hour or so of considered talking. And there may even be shared goals going on there.
Maybe.
To the
Especially
extent
because
that
it's so hyper local that you kind of end up with shared goals, you know, in ways that you might not otherwise, right? At minimum, you're like, well, I really hate the, you know, police station guys here, and they're like, yeah, we hate the police too.
Or we need a new basketball court at the local school. We've all got kids that are crying out for it. So I found that just a really direct explainer of what you're talking about. And it really does suggest, you know, it points to the importance of third spaces, which I'm sure we'll get to in a moment. But I want to kind of keep going on those two things that you mentioned that do work where, you know, sort of political debate doesn't. So we've covered off the relationships bit of things. The other one you said is our experiences. Talk us through that.
Yeah, so this is the other thing. I think, you know, one of the things in my research that I really care about is I'm a very interdisciplinary thinker, because I think some of the biggest issues that we deal with are just too big. And we have to use multiple disciplines, you know, and honestly, with great deference and respect to so many academics that I use the work of and talk to and care about, like, I think we're messing up some of the big questions because we're stuck in disciplines. All of which is to say, a routine finding across many different fields of both psychology, sociology, neuroscience, and they always just find new jargon for this in each field, but it's basically the same finding, is that people's views tend to follow from their actions and not the other way around, which is very much not how the Western model of the mind would imagine things. We tend to have the idea like, oh, I thought, you know, objectively for myself alone, and then I came up with an idea, and then I actioned the idea in the world. And that might be how you, I don't know, decide to rearrange your living room, but it's probably not how you rearrange your politics. And in fact, the evidence suggests that very often what happens is that people engage in a small action in their life. They might even be compelled to undertake that action, which means they didn't really choose it. They had to for like whatever reason. And then their views shift after that. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the more interesting ones is there's something called the Turnaway study, which is looking at people, obviously mostly women, who have been denied abortions that they wanted. And they kind of pair those women up against women who are otherwise very much the same in terms of demographics and other factors in their life, but did get the abortion that they wanted. So they it's a pairing study, but a big one, like thousands of women. And they just say, you know, okay, let's see. Like if you take a woman from the South who earns this much money, blah, 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 wanted an abortion, got one, and you compare to one that's almost the same, but you didn't get one, what happens to them and how do they compare? And you can kind of find out quite a lot from this sort of study. I mean, look, as a sidebar, obviously lots of things happen to women who are denied abortions that are bad. They end up in worse relationship situations, they have worse finances. But interestingly, one of the things that happens to them that we might not expect, certainly I wouldn't necessarily intuit this as a very pro-choice person, is that the women who are denied abortions that they want become more in favor or more pro-life or less in favor of abortion rights. They become more in favor of the thing they actually experienced.
Yeah.
Right? Which was having this baby, basically. And a lot of our political views probably are in part due to this fact, which is just that we...
confirmation bias that we're programmed to stick to. Yeah.
And again, it also allows us to have a narrative of ourselves as good people and agents in the world, which is, again, like a lot of what that work of cognitive dissonance is doing. And there's lots of other evidence. And I mean, this is a more extreme case in a way, but there's lots of evidence for this in lots of other areas of our life. The people who experience extreme weather events become more convinced and concerned about climate change. People who, interestingly, when bans are passed in cities and they seem pretty permanent, people get on board with the bans quite quickly. They sort of shift their mind by being within the ban itself. Like, let's say there's a ban of smoking or plastic water bottles. They're like, okay, yeah, actually it's fine. I don't mind not being able to do a plastic water bottle. We tend to shift our mind towards our actions. And that's both amazing and also obviously could be really bad. Like, it's also the reason people get on board with, totalitarian
Fascism.
Yeah, like literal fascism, because it's just easier for us in a way to resolve that dissonance. And if we feel powerless, we'll resolve that dissonance towards the situation we're in. There's lots of evidence, for example, that the most oppressed people in society often believe that the status quo is necessary, or at least inescapable, because that allows them essentially to get through the day, And like, fair enough in some ways, but also it's obviously heartbreaking. So what that means, though, is, I'm not saying, therefore, we should just give up on humans, even though they function this way. What it means, I think, for people who want to in some way change or improve the world is actually something much more basic, which is that if you want to change people's minds, you need to change their life. You need to give them an experience of life that is different than what they've previously experienced, and that hopefully will allow them to shift their beliefs towards the point of view you hope they have, And the way I talk about this in the book is in terms of gateway actions, which is, again, a term I took from sociology, but now the activists I work with find quite useful. But a gateway action is a small political action. It might even be effectively meaningless, like recycling. Like from an environmental perspective, recycling a little bit, whatever, But but it turns out that people who recycle then become more interested in the rest of environmentalism because it makes them feel good to recycle. Now they do other stuff. And, there are many, many gateway actions, a lot of which are basically useful mostly as recruitment, that activists can bring into people's lives. Like, imagine the tobacco, but now in the tobacco you can donate a little bit of money or clothing or food to migrants. I wonder what would happen to the people in that town. It's really easy for them to feel good about themselves by donating to migrants. And then maybe the next step is you ask them to come bring the stuff directly to the migrants. And then they meet the migrants, right? Like, this is the basic fundamental building blocks of what has long been called community organizing, a term that could mean almost anything. But that is in reality a different form of political reasoning. And it's the political reasoning form that has to do with relationships and with actions. And that's what's much more effective for people on the whole.
So really what you're saying is, rather than beat people over the head with ideology, ideas, facts and reasoning, you actually try to find what spaces, practices, rituals that they can be exposed to that open them up to a way of thinking, a way of being. So what are some examples of, I guess, people who have been able to do that, who've reverse engineered things effectively? I mean, the example of getting teenage daughters to go and talk to their fathers, And I remember Sarah Silverman did this in one of I think it was the 2016, election over in the US. She got a whole heap of Jewish people, her Jewish friends, to go to Florida and have afternoon tea or, coffee with their grandparents and just sort of be there talking politics, and sort of switch them around. She called it the Great Schlep. And from what I understand, it was quite effective. So what are sort of examples? Is it spaces? Is it rituals? Is it, I don't know, inviting your friends to a food co-op situation or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, I write a lot about food co-ops in my book. I'm a part of a food co-op. And to be clear, the kind of food co-op I'm a part of is not like a bunch of bougie people getting organic kale. It's actually a food co-op that was started here in London to help people find accessible food, like cheap food, basically. And the way it works is that you go around and you knock on your neighbors' doors and you ask them like, hey, do you want to get cheaper food? Especially vegetables is the easiest thing, but there's other things. We'll buy in bulk together. So you just buy in bulk together. And there's a distribution hub that they've kind of organized for this stuff, but you could even do it without that. And, if you buy vegetables and fruits in bulk, you can massively reduce their price. And a lot of your groceries, especially once you add, often places will donate food to this system. So you can get a lot of your groceries for about £3 to £5 a week, which is nothing really compared to what most people have to pay for groceries. And when I talked to the organizers who have this system, they said, we don't really care about food. It's good. It's good, obviously, that people who have little income have cheap food, but we're in it because what happens is that then 18 people are all together in a community. They're usually a block or two away. They're really close. And they know each other in London, in a city where many people don't know any of their neighbors. And then all the other magic starts to happen. Because then, people start building solidarity. They realize, like, oh, you're not getting your vegetables this week. Are you okay? Oh, you're in hospital. Can I help you? Oh, like, you don't know how to cook this thing? Let me show you. Oh, does anyone have, like, a vacuum cleaner? And then over time, when bigger things happen, especially, like, eviction, right? Suddenly people will be like, I'm so sorry, but I'm getting evicted. And their neighbors will be like, no, I'm going to come and just stand in your house so you can't get evicted. And it's a gateway, right? It's a gateway. Yeah. And a lot of organizing is about gateways. And I would say, unfortunately, it's especially about gateways because we are in a particularly, believe it or not, depoliticized time. And I know that might not sound true because on the internet, everyone is screaming at each other about politics and they're super politicized in this way. But people are mostly not politicized in the sense that they're collectively organized.
Yeah.
Almost no one is collectively organized. We've seen the decline of unions, especially for working class people. Like nowadays, it's more likely that you're in a union if you're an upper class person. And like, that's actually not as helpful. Political parties are wildly incompetent and often run by bureaucrats and criminals and people that are lining the pockets. We're not collectively organized in the way that we might have been in previous eras. There aren't vast social movements, partially because the governments have really shut them down. And so not only that, but individual people can't even imagine what it would mean to do collective action anymore. When I talk to people, the number one problem I find all the time is I'll ask them, like, what's your theory of power? What's your theory of how people collectively can change the world? And they cannot imagine it. Really. They have a very hazy idea of how people collectively change the world or what they could do. They don't even really feel comfortable going to talk to someone else and saying like, hey, do you also care about this? Let's work on it together. In fact, I would say that my number one goal as a writer over the next few decades and a speaker is just to help people develop both the skills and the imagination, and I mean imagination in a completely unfluffy sense, so that they could do collective action. I think that that's like the number one thing I could do for the rest of my life. Yeah.
You use the term in the book social atrophy, and I totally agree with you here. There's so many reasons why we've descended into social atrophy, and they all work simultaneously and interconnectedly as, part of the complex system, set up that we're in, to make it really problematic. There's institutional, structural reasons for why we can't connect in a third space together and get this kind of thing done. So let's maybe talk about that a little bit. I mean, we don't have to rattle off the reasons why. We know what they are. The fragmentation, polarization that's been created by AI, social media. As you say, the neoliberal setup has got rid of those, the unions and those entities. I call them the moral umpires on the footy field of life. These entities that would bring us together to be able to be politically engaged and ensure that, certain people's worst excesses don't go and ruin the planet. You've talked about sort of ways that, we can create, spaces and rituals, like food co-ops to bring us together. But what else can we do to combat this social atrophy?
Let's first of all, just for a minute, I'm just going to define what it is. So social atrophy is a word that primarily, I actually use it to talk about the actual changes in the brain when we are socially isolated, because the brain is a bit like a muscle, to use a clunky but reasonable metaphor. And when we don't use any given part of our brain, we lose that ability over time, pretty much, right? That's why I've forgotten all the foreign languages I learned. But it's also why we can lose some of our social ability and skill and energy, because much of our brain is set up for social life. It's maybe the most taxing thing our brain ever has to do on a regular basis. That's why people who are highly social get dementia less, because they're just really exercising their brain every day. It's why everyone felt exhausted having social interactions after COVID. It's a very important muscle in the brain that actually affects lots of the other systems in the brain. And when we don't use our social muscle in the brain, we lose it. That's like the term social atrophy is technically for that. Now, of course, it also ends up being used not so much by me, but by most people, to talk about like the weakening of the social fabric as well, like the weakening of the ties between us. And in some ways it's a reasonable word for both, you know?
Yeah.
I don't want to be too sloppy, but it's worth saying that these are very significant psychological effects that we're talking about. And I'm writing my next book on social atrophy, so I've interviewed these like neuroscience researchers, and it's scary stuff. And one of the main things that happens is that we lose our social appetite. So we stop feeling like we want to socialize. And this is why I'm honestly, by this point in writing my next book, quite unhappy that people call things a loneliness crisis. Because we are not lonelier than we have been in previous generations. There is no good empirical evidence that we feel any lonelier than we used to. We are just more alone. And that is a really different thing. People who are lonely crave social contact. They want to have friends. They want to see people. They have other problems. I mean, to be honest with you, when you look at the data in detail, people who are lonely are primarily anxious and depressed people. People who are anxious and depressed anyway, and then part of that manifests as loneliness. But people who just have social atrophy, who just haven't been socializing for a while, they don't necessarily feel lonely. They are actually like, I'm fine. Other people are stressful. I'm happy to be on my couch with my Netflix/video games/phone. Yeah. And that's much more worrying to me. The other thing that tends to happen to people when they're socially atrophied, besides that their brain literally shrinks, is that they become more paranoid. And I mean this in the social way. So they're not paranoid where they're like, aliens are going to eat my brain, the FBI has a camera on my house. They're paranoid in the sense that they are like, my best friend doesn't actually like me very much. I think she didn't text me back. You know, people are talking about me at that party. I can't go to that party. And I would say I've experienced this form of paranoia personally, and in many ways. Certainly, they're usually in very stressful social situations anyway, for whatever reason, but I'll find myself having incredibly ungenerous interpretations of people. And the more isolated you are, the more you can be caught in that kind of loop. And it's very destructive because it means that you stop reaching out to people, you stop engaging with them. Anyway, I just want to say this is a very complicated systemic brain problem, you know, and it's...
I'll just add something in there that I've observed on social media over the last couple of years is also the kind of cognitive justifying that's going on. The number of memes sort of declaring to the world that somebody has, you know, neurodivergence, or they're a empath, or they're an introvert, and therefore justifying why they don't want to go out, why they find people too much, and so on. So it's now become a trope, you know, almost a fashionable trope to be incapable of being social.
Yeah, I think there is a kind of glamorization of it, you know, and I think that is really unfortunate, not because everyone else is great, but because the cost of our social atrophy is incredibly high, you know?
Yeah.
So yes, I mean, look, part of the solution to this, it's actually annoyingly a really complicated social problem. I get into it a bit in this book, and then the next book is all about this. Some of it is what you would imagine. It's decline of the church, you know, and look, I'm a secular Jew, but like, it just turns out that people doing a religion does help them be social, and like certain kinds of coordinated work. It's the decline of the union. It's the decline of the workplace in a way, right? I mean, in general, like, people are not going into the workplace. Who are they socializing with? I don't know about you, but when COVID hit, I left my last workplace and I have never gone back. I don't have colleagues, you know? It's the decline of the comfort that people used to have with letting their kids run around in the street. It's the fact that we move for work all the time, so we don't know our neighbors. I mean, it's kind of it's one of those big social trends where everything has kind of pushed in one direction, and we're seeing a lot of effects. It's so many things. It's also, and this is a more awkward thing, and I'm only really getting into that in the next book, but it's also partially that we're single. People are a lot more single than they used to be. And look, again, I'm a polyamorous, like, weirdo. So I'm not saying like we need the nuclear family, but I am saying that we have seen a bunch of interesting institutions decline and nothing has really taken their place. So whether or not you think marriage is great, it did basically cover a bunch of people's loneliness. Sorry, it prevented their social atrophy. See, even I get caught in the language loop. It prevented their social atrophy because there was at least one other person in the house with them all the time. And we actually now have a very complicated gender/financial problem with our society where especially lower income men and women just do not get married, and they are alone, or they are living in their parents' house but not really interacting with people that much. And that is very bad for us. It doesn't mean the solution is like we need more heterosexual marriage. I'm not a conservative in this respect, but we just have a bunch of social problems that are all pushing in this direction. Yeah. We need social infrastructure, right? We need like the tobacco. I write a lot about that, and we're going to have to build it ourselves, probably because of neoliberalism, yes, but also because governments actually don't love social infrastructure usually. They might build some big social infrastructure projects here or there for other reasons, often as a way of kind of, you know, in good years of the human history, they do that to like bribe the populace, you know, in the gentle way. But they also are pretty worried about social infrastructure, especially social infrastructure they can't control. And history is long with examples of governments basically being like, especially coffee shops. There's like big fear of coffee shops because it's a place where people are together and they're not drunk. So they like might strategize, and they might strategize you away. Um,
Is that real? Is that a fear of coffee shops? Is that something that's been documented or written about?
Yeah, there's like great articles about it. I actually write about it in the book. In chapter 6, I give a couple of examples. In the Ottoman Empire, they banned coffee shops for a while because they were worried that there would be a plot against the government, and there was. And then, in England, there's like the first few coffee shops in the 1600s, and everyone loves this drug because obviously coffee is amazing. And then the government kind of freaks out because they're like, this is worse than pubs. When people went and got drunk and in like a medieval pub, they were sort of like boozing and maybe having crazy sex and whatever, but they're unlikely to overthrow the government because they're not that focused. Their worry was basically in the coffee shop, people conspire. And they weren't wrong. The coffee shops did help organize revolutions. And then the government even like spreads rumors. They're like, coffee will make men impotent. They're just, it's a danger in a way to people in power whenever other people can gather together and meet, especially sober. And so, look, we need a social infrastructure, and we're going to have to build it ourselves. And, it's worth saying, usually people tell me, like, I want to build a social infrastructure. I want to build a really, like, beautiful, like, queer-centered crystals maze. And I'll be like, that sounds amazing. Don't do that. That's not what we need,
So what do we need?
We need social infrastructure, first of all, that is probably already in your community but falling apart and being neglected. Like, the number one thing you should do isn't even make a new social infrastructure. It's just go find the social
I'm with you there.
that already exists, that, don't do, because the thing is, if you build a private or expensive social infrastructure, even something where the latte is £5 or whatever, then only people who can afford a £5 latte are going to be in your social infrastructure. And meanwhile, everyone who can't afford that or has other problems, they're disabled, they need this or that, they're not going to come. And you need to go find the social infrastructure that was already serving loads of people and then make sure it doesn't die. I mean, that's like the number one thing. And it's totally unglamorous. And the bad news about almost everything that's politically worth doing is it's really unglamorous. It's way less glamorous than debating. It's much less glamorous, even than making your own coffee shop. It's like just showing up to the public library and doing stuff for it,
Yeah. So give us some examples of the spaces, the third spaces that actually bring people together and give them these kinds of experiences that then enable them to open up to, let's say, life-bettering, life-generating political ideas. So libraries, coffee shops, what other sort of spaces should we be preserving, potentially also creating down the track if they've already been destroyed in our community?
Yeah, I mean,
the food co-op's a great one. The food co-op's another example. There's these networks, community gardens. They're everywhere.
Yeah. Libraries, parks, public places. I mean, I write a lot about the social fabric that was supporting the civil rights movement, for example. And in a way, those folks were very good at using the infrastructure they had, and they had it in part for bleak reasons. They had it because, of course, they weren't allowed in other people's social infrastructure because of segregation and hatred and racism. But for example, they used everything. I mean, they even used the hair salon, right? The hair salon for Black folks is like still a place of cultural and social organizing, but certainly in that time it was. And you might be given like political materials by someone running the hair salon. So that's an example. I think, increasingly, honestly, in climate world, we're probably going to have cooling spaces that become the political third infrastructure. Like, I would love to see cooling spaces that Barcelona has recently created like every 5-minute walk, there is a cooling space. So you will always be living 5 minutes from a cooling space. And if people manage to make those into organizing hubs for social change, that would be amazing. But we're going to need
cooling space. What are you talking about?
It's an air conditioned space. But the idea is that, as you and I discussed before we started recording, it's not a good idea that every space should be air conditioned in a city because it completely screws up the world, right? So instead, a better plan that we are trying to execute is like, okay, maybe there's one cooling space that everyone can go to in the neighborhood. There's one 5 minutes away from everyone, right?
The Peruvian government here, once the heat wave was announced, opened up the canal for swimming. Now, it's perfectly safe for swimming. It's just that it has to be policed and monitored so that people don't drown. But it is the hub of the city right now. Everybody is at the canal, especially in the evenings. And there's teenage kids, old people, just sitting there with their feet in the canal, kids jumping off the bridges, which theoretically they're not allowed to do. But the police have given up. They're just keeping an eye on it, making sure people
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
do anything too stupid and don't drown. But it's actually brought incredible joy and pride. Like everyone's super excited about the fact there's this craziness going on where people are swimming in the canal. And so, yeah, cooling spaces, that's a super interesting idea, because I can tell you in Paris right now, I'm spending my days trying to find somewhere cool to be,
Yeah.
Googling hotels that have lobbies where people can go and work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, these infrastructures are super important, preserving them, supporting them, and so on. But you mentioned the idea of the food co-op. You go to a food co-op. You find it really wonderful. You've
Yeah.
explained
I think
why
I
it
do
works.
food co-op more than go anywhere, but yes, yes.
Yes. So how do we get the people that we're trying to bring along with us on this ride? How do we get them to these spaces? I mean, obviously talking about it, reasoning them with them and giving them lots of facts about third spaces, and experiences that, they need to be doing to be able to open themselves up. That's not going to work. So what are some techniques that get people to these spaces with us?
Here's what I do. I tend not to tell people, look, it's great if you can offer people a thing they need. Like, obviously, if you can give them cheap food or air conditioning, that's wonderful. But I would actually say I no longer primarily focus on that as an organizer. Rather, that's not true. I quietly build the material stuff people want. Like, I think that's really important. But the other thing that I tend to do in terms of like getting people into places is I actually ask them for their help. Because my experience is that people, and there's lots of probably evidence about this too, but like, I'll just start with that, is that people are quite individualistic and they can find attempts to give them things they might want, like both understandably condescending and also it's just uncomfortable for people. Like they feel like I shouldn't be receiving a handout, blah, 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 right? So when I want someone to really join a movement, I don't tell them what they're going to get out of it necessarily. I usually ask them for their help, which is, in my view, both more genuine and more humble. I'm like, I need your help. And I do need their help. I usually do need their help because I need everyone's help to do a thing. So I'll say, it would be great if you would join the food co-op. We would love you. You're such a good part of the community. Like, we need you. And that's
Yeah.
true. And so I guess I've been trying to flip that around in the way I work to say, like, I need you,
Have you come across the Benjamin Franklin effect? Apparently, when he was starting out in politics, there was somebody, I think, across from the other side who was just trolling him, and it was unbearable. And eventually what he did is he went and asked this person collected rare books, and he went and asked for a copy of this particular rare book. And the trolls was so chuffed that he was needed, he sent this book over immediately. And off the back of that, they developed a friendship. So it's this idea that, it
makes sense. This is what we're here for, like we are. I mean, it's really boring. I'm not a very normative person in a lot of ways. Like, you want to live your life a weird way, great, whatever. I think there's very few norms you can apply to human life. I think sociality is one of them. And I think our sociality is in large part about interdependence. It's not just chit chat. It's like we want to be needed. We want to be important to other people. We want to feel like we had a good role in their life. And when we're lacking that, like I just think we fall apart. That's what we're here for. So yeah.
Yeah, it's very much about show, don't tell, invite, don't force people into these kinds of new ways of thinking. One question I really wanted to ask you is, like, a lot of people who are listening to this podcast and who have read my work, we tend to hit a point where we find ourselves talking about all of this kind of information. And quite often we'll be at a dinner party or a barbecue or at a cafe, and somebody's like wanting to discuss a complex idea. And it can be really difficult talking about some of the ideas that are going on in the world today, because to do so, we've got to leave the linear mindset that we're all so entrenched in, where we just talk about an isolated issue, let's say the climate crisis, and we ignore all the externalities and the ripple-on effects, the domino effect, and, the rare earth minerals that are being used, the slavery required to produce the batteries, all this kind of thing. Do you have any advice for being able to talk about difficult subjects? So I know that where debating doesn't work, ramming people over the head with facts and figures doesn't work. Are there some nuanced tips that you can give for people so that, they're able to talk about this kind of stuff with friends and family?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I write about in the book is something called deep canvassing. And I want to start out here by saying, like, this isn't how you should change the world. This is just what you might want to do if you have to deal with your difficult neighbor most of the time, or relative, because deep canvassing is like a very specific technique that you have to learn. It's really time intensive. It does seem to work better than normal canvassing, and it does seem to persuade people, and that's amazing, but it's so time intensive that for most social movements, that's not what you need. That said, I'll tell you how deep canvassing works. So that way, if you are at the dinner table with your uncle, you can at minimum have a less frustrating experience, maybe. The way that deep canvassing works is like, look, with normal canvassing, you go to the door, you knock on the door, you're like, hey, are you going to vote for blah? And the person's like, yeah. And if they're like, yeah, then you're like, okay, I'll come pick you up on the day for the polls. It helps with turnout. And most research suggests it only helps with turnout. You know, it doesn't help with persuasion. If you meet someone who says they disagree with you and you talk to them, that doesn't seem to help them. If they are on the fence, that talking doesn't seem to do very much. It's just a turnout tool for the most part. Relational organizing, a little bit different because the relationship pulls people a little bit, but it's not the most effective thing, canvassing usually. Deep canvassing, you go to the door, you knock on the door, you say like, hey, how are you, you know, how much in favor are you of, I don't know, like gender neutral bathrooms or whatever, right? This has been used a lot for LGBTQ stuff. And then the person will say like, let's say you say like, okay, you're 100% opposed or 100% in favor, right? You know, 0 to 10. And they'll say, oh, I'm a 2. And you want them to be at 10. But you don't ask them like, why aren't you at 10? This is so important, blah, blah, blah. You say, oh, why aren't you at 0? And then that person has to say their own reasons why they're not at a 0. And they have to hear from their own mouth with their own words and their own motivations why they might come to agree with you. Because as the person who invented this technique noted, they're always going to believe themselves in the conversation. You know, they're going to believe their own like voice. And that's an important part of the deep canvassing. And that's something you can do with your neighbors and your relatives, right? And then the other part of it is that you're having them express ambivalence, which is a difficult thing for humans. I'm very bad at ambivalence at times. I hate it. I find it very painful, but it turns out I'm not alone. Like most people, ambivalence is a really difficult thing to feel and even articulate and notice in yourself. So you're letting them do that. And this helps with cognitive dissonance, obviously, or perhaps not obviously, but it's part of it. And then the other thing that happens is that you share an experience from your own life about how that thing affects you, or at least someone you know, right? So like maybe you're not trans, but you can talk about your trans friend or whatever. And that seems to help, especially if you're really non-judgmental towards them, you know, like if you can kind of be like, oh, that's really interesting. I can see your point of view. Well, I just know that, you know, I have a friend and this is how it affects them. Like that kind of conversation seems to essentially pull on all the relational parts of our brain so that we are able for the first time maybe to consider the issue another way. And deep canvassing has been shown to be much more successful at actually moving people on the political spectrum and keeping them in a new position. It works over time, which is very impressive. I would say, you know, still it's not the best tool for organizing because it's so much time. And if you only have 40 hours to do something, most of the time, unless there's like a really important building passed in your territory, persuading people on the fence actually isn't that important. It's not, I know we have this in our democratic model, but like you probably need something else in that case. If you're working against climate change, it probably isn't even the issue because most people kind of agree with you. They're just unmotivated. There are just other things we need to be doing a lot of the time. But it's a quite useful technique if you have to talk to someone you disagree with, you know. If you can manage it, takes training.
So we've covered a kind of a kaleidoscope of different interconnected ideas, you know, our experiences and getting people into spaces where they can have a shared experience with people who have other ideas and who role model a different way of being. That's a really great way of going about things. The relationship side of things, it's the third spaces. For anyone who's listening and they're really wanting to get more engaged, what would be some, and they're wanting to do something in the next 6 months, you know, they're wanting to really get started on this kind of thing and be part of what I call the sort of the laying out of the ideas that need to be lying around as the old world crumbles and we start to build the what comes next, you know, to quote Milton Friedman's famous quote, you know, the ideas need to be lying around, you know, so that we can create the what comes next. So for anyone who wants to be part of that movement, what would you suggest they go out and prioritize? You said that sort of deep canvassing takes a lot of work. It's not necessarily what you would focus on. Yeah. What should we be doing and focusing on?
I mean, I actually have a blog post on my Substack that just says like what to do instead of talking about politics. And I would go and look at that. And like, I think, unfortunately, all of the answers are like not incredibly sexy, but they're all incredibly important. And they are basically, first of all, you should join the thing with other people. Like this is not a thing to be doing on your own. It's not a thing to be doing with just one friend, even, although I actually do some things with my friend Max, who do a lot of teaching together. But, you know, mostly you want to be in like a larger structure. And I know right away that that's going to turn some people off because you're going to think, what if I like these people? And now we're going to have to negotiate with them and they're going to bring the wrong snacks and they're going to have the wrong political opinions. And I hate this. And
I'm very much like that. Yeah. So what kind of size group is the most effective for just
it really depends on what the issue is, unfortunately. I can't give you that. But, you know, like at the end of the day, like something like climate change, sorry, we need to be motivated to be coordinated in the millions. Like, this is a big deal, you know? So, and the other reason that we need to join something with other people is that, and I say this as a person who's certainly guilty of this myself, like, we don't have the skills. And I think this is really hard for a lot of people I talk to accept, because we're all very smart people who read so many books and like have so many good opinions and went to so many fancy degrees. And guess what? Like, I have 3 fancy ass degrees from like Harvard, Cambridge, and Oxford, and I don't have the skills. You know, I don't have some of these skills, because these skills are skills that you learn through doing. There's skills about like listening to other people. There's skills about reading a room. There's skills about being patient when other people suck. I just don't have them. I have at least at minimum the humility to know that even after 6 years of being a mutual aid coordinator, working with like elderly people and poor people and disadvantaged people and disabled people, and like, I still don't have the skills. It's so hard. And you know, only really experienced organizers end up with these skills usually, and you need to build the skills now. So you're going to have to go join a movement now to start building the skills. And the place where you join the movement is going to be massively imperfect, and you're going to be really annoyed by the people, and you're going to have to stick it out pretty much, while occasionally switching movements maybe, because you have to build the skills in community with other people in a coalition, which is annoying, and you're going to have to do it consistently. Like, we just have a problem of both individualist mindset and the wrong skill set that needs overcoming in this way.
Yeah.
Then you need to reinforce the social infrastructure in your community. We need to do this because, to be honest with you, I think we're not going to get to choose this, the issue that we're going to end up with, right? Like, we don't know whether, sadly and darkly, whether we're going to end up mostly fighting this battle because there's a food shortage, and then that's how we like convince the government to do something, or whether it's going to be flooding, or whether it's going to be fire, or whether it's going to be heat wave, or what, you know, we don't, like, we're basically probably going to almost certainly run into some massive, terrifying issue. And we are going to be useless on our own. What we're going to be useful for is if we've built a network of other people who have learned to coordinate together, even when they're not getting along especially well, to do an important thing for the community in the social infrastructure that they've been building up for 10 years. That's what we have to go do. And it is like not at all sexy. But you know what? I will say this, and this is one of the few things that keeps me going. And I know you wanted to ask about that. I have a couple of other thoughts as well.
Yeah.
One of the things I looked at the end of the book is like, okay, all these things I've been describing, these huge shifts in mindset and skills and behavior and anti-individualism, essentially, a certain kind of individualism anyway, right? You can certainly have your own individual art taste or whatever. Like, well, there's a lot of evidence that left-wing people are less happy than right-wing people. And I was very curious about this, and I kind of ended up looking in depth at all this research. And honestly, even when you control for lots of other factors that you could blame for this, it's true. Like, if you control for marriage, religiosity, money, whatever, like, still, if you are a left-wing person, you're more unhappy than a right-wing person usually, because...
Particularly females, young left-wing females.
Really,
I think
and honestly, it kind of makes sense, because you look at the world and you're like, damn, we're so screwed, right? And you see all the injustice, and that's very interesting. But the good news is that if you're a left-wing person and you're actively involved in a social movement or some kind of activism, you're much happier. So basically, you can reclaim your happiness if
it reverses it. Yeah.
And that is the medicine we got, you know? And I think and the reason I think this is difficult for people to believe when I first say it is that in our culture, the way that we model happiness is as ease. The way we model it is as ease. We're like, oh yeah,
I'm
like
totally with you on that. And
technology or this blender or this, I don't know, quick hack for your brain is going to make things easy for you, and then you're going to be happy. But actually being happy and having ease are not that closely related to each other, you know? And especially they're not that closely related to each other in the long run, because really
in fact, human history shows that it's actually when we've lived in times of friction and discomfort that we've produced the greatest well-being indicators. You know, the example being during the London Blitz. Everybody expected people to fall apart. In fact, it was the happiest time in British history, also the healthiest time. Because of the austerity measures that were put in place. So great art and philosophy has, flourished in times of difficulty.
Yeah, and, basically, in short, we are happiest. Most research suggests the number one predictor of our happiness is the quality of our relationships with other people, right? It's like your marriage and then...
Which are never comfortable. They're never comfortable or easy.
I honestly, good luck having a... marriage is hard, right? As they always say, but it is. It's just hard because you have to accommodate yourself to the other, and that's incredibly inconvenient. And your spouse always wants the wrong thing with the dishwasher and the metaphor for the dishwasher. And so, what I'm saying is that the really unglamorous, uncomfortable, annoying, relational, frictiony stuff that no one wants is exactly what will make them happy, and they just don't know it yet, And so I am the proselytizer for that. But I all I can say is I'm a proselytizer for it as a person who's done it and has really been through like many of the really trenches of it as well. I like live in a communal home, and like there are problems, and sometimes people have to leave. That is honestly heartbreaking. You know, I've done organizing and I've watched most people drop off and just a few long distance runners keep it going, and like that is heartbreaking. I have had movements fail. Mostly if you have in a movement on the left, it fails. You just don't get what you want. You know, like I have been through it, and I think I can still honestly say, both as a data person and an individual person, that the good news though is that when I wake up in the morning, I never worry that I'm not doing the thing I need to do. I mean, I sometimes worry I've got the strategy wrong. Don't get me wrong. Like I'm sometimes like, well, maybe I shouldn't write a book. Maybe I should do something else. But there's nothing really you can trade for that feeling, and there's nothing really you can trade for knowing other people exist in the world that have your phone number, that you can call, who care and are doing something. Yeah. And so, yeah, I'm just a big proselytizer for that. That's what we got to do.
Yep. Okay. One final little element to all of that is politics, politically speaking. A lot of people are particularly in the US, are very, disillusioned with politics. They've given up on democracy. What do we need to preserve and fight for in that kind of space? I mean, protest, I think, is something we should we should protest for the right to protest. That's certainly up there as one of my priorities. Is there anything else that you would add to that in terms of what works, what we need to actually be doing to ensure we can keep communicating humanity, with humanity and pulling them forward to the better outcomes?
Yeah, so one of the things I made a reel recently, which I think how you found me, which is just me talking about what protest. And here, I mean specifically demonstration, because actually there are many kinds of protests, right? Like strikes are a form of protest, blowing stuff up is a form of protest, boycotts are a form of protest. Those things work for other reasons if they work, which is complicated, because they hold something material, like from the hands of the people who are powerful, right? But with demonstration, it's essentially a speech act. You're just kind of like in the streets yelling. And when they did measurements on whether demonstrations are effective, the answer is not in a direct way, right? I mean, the way I say it in the thing is more like polarizing maybe, but like it's not in a direct way. It's not that the government sees there's a demonstration and they think like, oh damn, we better do something. In fact, they rarely change their policy because there's a demonstration and there's not really any obvious like direct effect. Similarly with like public opinion, people's opinion changes a little bit around the time of the demonstration, and then it goes back to normal pretty quickly. So that's not what a demonstration is doing. But there is one group of people who are really changed by demonstrations, and that's the people in them, the protesters. Those people are changed for life, which makes sense because their relationships and their own actions have shifted, right? And therefore, what I would say about a demonstration is like, okay, it's a thing that is there for mobilization, retention, and recruitment, which are very important things. It's basically a giant party, and you invite all your friends, and then you like get them hooked, right?
Except it's not how the French see it. The French see it as just what you do on a Saturday. It's their social life. It's their sport. They go to a protest and then they go and have a coffee afterwards or a beer afterwards with their friends. It's what you do. And it's an ongoing thing. You don't just go once for one big one,
Yeah, right. And I guess what I would say here is, this matters because we should have demonstrations sometimes, but we should use them for what they're for, which is making all of your friends come and then recruiting them. And then the thing I think most movements are frankly terrible at still is like, when someone comes to a demonstration, they should immediately be like, get all their contact information taken. A buddy is provided to them. The buddy follows up with them. The buddy brings them to the next meeting. The buddy checks in with them and figures out their skill set and assigns them cool tasks to do. The buddy wishes them happy birthday. Like there's so much more we could be doing that most movements really haven't thought about because they're, again, like we're thinking at such an individualistic level where everything is about ease. But this is not about ease. This is about like being in it for life, as I say,
Yeah, yeah.
So that's yeah, sorry, I've almost lost the question because I'm so passionate about this. But
No, it was about what kind of political setups and structures should we be preserving / creating that can best serve us.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've talked about a bunch of them. I think there's probably a role for a different kind of political party, right? And, this is always a controversial thing to say because people will think like, oh, you want Maoism or something. Like, I don't want Maoism. But like, there have been models of the political party where people are members, where they are committed in terms of their resources, both time and money, where they agree on a decision and then they pursue it even when some members disagree, right? Where like you basically come to a democratic decision-making process about the strategy and then you do it even if you disagree. Yeah. And I think we are in time where that is so important because the reality is like a lot of people will come to me during our movement organizing workshops or fascism stuff or whatever, anti-fascism stuff, obviously. And they're like, what can we do? And I don't have a single answer because we don't know. like, and worse, here's the worst news. It's also not like an aesthetic question, right? I think a lot of people, you ask them, like, what is your view about how we should create social change? And they tell you what they wish were true. And, like, they're like, I really want to believe that if I create like really beautiful art, it will inspire people and then the world will change. But like, look, I want that to be true also, but it has no relationship between what I want to be true and what's actually true. And so instead, if you're working in politics, you basically and I mean this in the broad sense of politics, like grassroots included, you're not going to get the answer you want. Like, reality won't conform to your desire for how the world will work. You're actually just going to have to try things out. And then if they don't work, you're going to have to pick something else until you find something that does work. And it might not be the strategy you wanted. And I think that is really hard for people that are like used to consumerism, because they're like, well, I should do whatever I feel like. And like, no, like, this has nothing to do with what we feel like. It's just going to be
being able to buy an outcome out there somewhere, The thing that I say, and I think it's relevant here, is that a lot of people feel that all the work they've put into the climate movement or whatever, it's going nowhere, it's all a waste of time. And I'm like, no. The way that emergence works is that every single little piece of activity will move the system in a particular kind of direction. So if it's infused with care, and if it's infused with a desire to connect and collaborate with other humans and produce more life-generating ideas, it's all going to count. It just might not be direct. It's going to be a more sort of a interrelated, build on layers, mushing kind of effect that we don't always see with our linear lenses on.
Yeah, I think basically we're not going to be able to tell in advance like what's going to work. We're going to have to try stuff, which means we're going to have to commit to someone else's plan for a while and just do it and see if it works, because it needs a lot of people involved.
And we do it because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I think, like, it's just not an individualist thing. I mean, look at the food co-op. Something someone says to me all the time about the food co-op is they're like, but what if one week everyone wants to have broccoli and I want to have an eggplant, And I'm like, yeah, that'll suck. I think you should get some broccoli, because the idea of being in the food co-op is more important, right? Than the aubergine or whatever. And I don't mean this in some sort of like sex implied way. Like, I think that ability to forego most of the banal personal preferences to do a thing collectively is, again, one of these skills that we have just like lost, and we're going to have to go back and do it, because if we don't do it, the reality is that we will end up with infinite personal choice, and it will all be completely meaningless, because like the planet will burn to a crisp, and we'll live under like authoritarian fascist style governments, and all of our rights will be reversed, and that it just doesn't matter whether you get the aubergine. Sorry.
I think that's an awesome note to end on. That kind of says it all, live with the aubergine, it's going to be okay. Adjust and put your preferences second. Hey, Sarah, that was wonderful. I'm going to ask one last question. How do you personally cope? You've mentioned a few bits and pieces. I imagine activism is part of it, but how do you keep your humanity intact and be able to be such a beacon in this moment?
Gosh, I mean, I don't know if I'm beacon, but I'm trying to be useful. I think, okay, so obviously I talked about like doing stuff really matters, and I'm doing stuff all the time. So I think in many ways, I really get to escape that trap that so many of us are stuck in. So many people I know are stuck in, where they're like, I feel hopeless and I can't do anything. Because every day I get up and do something, Every day I'm talking to like another political group, or I feel very useful, and that's probably number one thing. I think also, like, for me, maybe because I studied history, I have a kind of like combination, like pessimism, optimism mix that is very helpful, where I look at this and I'm like, man, it's going to be a hard millennium, like, but I mean, I'm a very radical lefty Jew, but I'm Jewish, and I'm part of a 6,000-year-old tradition, and I would say, like, for me, more than a religion, it's a civilization that just happens to be spread out all across the globe. And 6,000 years is like peanuts compared to some things. So I just look at this, and I think one of the things I tend to do is I tend to be like, yeah, like, it's going to be a rough millennium. Like, probably isn't going to be a fun century either. In fact, it's a particularly bad century. But, I have this sort of sense that, like, time is very big. And I'm really invested in what people think in 1,000 years. So, like, I don't know. We might figure some shit out in 1,000 years,
Yeah. That cosmic insignificance, that being really pulled back from the screen and seeing the bigger picture of what's going on here, I think really helps. And to that end, reading and learning about humanity and how we've been in moments like this before is so important to what we're in. We can't be apathetic. We can't sort of shut off from this. at this juncture in history. Hey, Sarah, that was a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your time and your care, and good luck with your next book.
Thank
we'll
you.
Have to talk again when it comes out.
I would love that. I would love to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks
care.
again.
Bye.